Thank you. So one question that I get asked a lot because of the work that I've done applying computational linguistics and formal language theory to computer security is, how do I apply the principles that you talk about in the work that I do? And this is always a difficult question to answer because everybody's work is constrained not just by the problem domain that they're working on, the problem that they're trying to solve, but also the way that they're going about solving the problem-solving procedures that they practice in their day-to-day lives. So I hadn't really had the opportunity in anything except my open source projects up until fairly recently to tackle an entire software project and be able to think, okay, if I want to develop this so that it meets LangSec standards, how would I go about doing this? Until back in January, the company that I had started working for, Mount Noah Technologies, decided to make me CTO. So suddenly that was my job, and I basically got to start dog fooding on LangSec. So what do I mean when I talk about LangSec? If you're not familiar, let me catch you up on the parts that are relevant for this talk. We know from OWASP and from other vulnerability research agencies that most of the vulnerabilities that we deal with, particularly in the web domain, but everywhere else as well, are input handling bugs. Some input handling routine was supposed to handle a particular language, whether that's HTML or JavaScript or JSON or XML or PNG or TIFF or any other codec for that matter, and it didn't handle that input correctly, and an attacker was able to craft malicious input that exploited the software. So this is why we say full recognition before processing. If an input is not something that your program should recognize, but your program does recognize it anyway and goes ahead and acts on it, that means that your input handler is buggy. That means that you have written an input handler that will accept invalid input and that an attacker can craft packets for if it doesn't check to see, is this a valid input before doing anything else with it. Furthermore, however, it's critically important to have a very clear concept of not just what the pieces of your program are doing internally, but how they talk to each other. You have to know that because computers are very stupid, and you have to tell the computer exactly what to do, and if you tell it wrong, it will blissfully obey you. And without a really good reason, it's better to do simpler things simply because humans can understand them better and translate them into instructions for dumb computers better. Taylor Hornby observed a couple of years ago on the topic of data, which is the theme of this conference. I mentioned adversaries crafting packets, crafting data to control your program. This is exactly what Taylor is talking about here. This is the Tao of exploitation. So, how do we avoid that? Let's jump back into the past for a bit. Long, long ago, there was a project called the S360, and this man managed it. We're talking really old mainframes, some of which are still in use today in the financial system. When you use the phrase computer architecture, you are using a phrase that Fred Brooks coined. If you like lowercase letters, you have him to thank for them because the S360 used 8-bit characters instead of 6-bit characters because Fred was like, people would probably like to be able to use lowercase characters every once in a while. He's got more honors than I can list in multiple slides, but probably his most well-known contribution to the computer science field is the book The Mythical Man Month, which is largely drawn from his experiences managing the S360 and other IBM projects. This is the line for which he is probably best known. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. I'm sure everyone here has run into this problem. You're already behind schedule. You want to throw more people at the problem to solve it, but all that happens is the deadline just keeps slipping and slipping and slipping. He also observed, now Brooks' law is usually just constrained to that first sentence, but he goes on in the very same piece to talk about how you can figure out how long a project is going to take. It will take as long as it takes to do all of the pieces that are sequentially dependent. If you need to have A done in order to do B, and B done in order to do C, it will take as long as it takes to do A, then B, then C. You can't really get people working on those in parallel. However, if you have independent tasks, you can get people working on those in parallel. So that allows you to apply more people to it. But, and this also touches on an observation made by Melvin Conway, who pointed out that when you have a group that is designing a system, you tend to break that group down into subgroups, and they work on different parts of it, and invariably, the way that the system communicates internally ends up reflecting the structure of the groups that built it. This is often rephrased as, if you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you will get a 4-pass compiler. But Brooks concludes that you can't funge the sequential constraints versus the independent subtasks. If 2 tasks are dependent, you have to work on them one after the other, and so you cannot speed things up by trying to throw more people at it, unless what you actually have is more independent subtasks. He also talks a lot about scheduling. Now, this seems like a crazy amount of planning in the days of agile software development, i.e. now. Brooks was writing back during the days of what we called the waterfall method, which has mostly been put to rest. You still see it used in some government and military shops, but by and large, it's fallen out of favor, because what invariably ends up happening when you make a big elaborate plan and then implement that plan is that you find that reality has shifted during the time that you were busy planning, and now you have to play catch up, replanning the things that people are already coding. So I have a hack around this, which I'm going to get to a little bit later, and it basically involves kind of redefining what it is to be a prototype and what it is to plan. But we'll get into that very soon. The second system effect is another observation of Brooks's that I absolutely cannot emphasize too much. When you're prototyping a system, you leave all kinds of things out. You think, okay, I'll put this in next time because it'll make it even more awesome. And then the second system ends up being this top-heavy mess because you tried to put all the bells and whistles in and you didn't think about what you weren't going to need. So there's a page on the C2 wiki that talks about both this and the third system effect, pointing out that the ideal is to get the just exactly what you need functionality of the first system and the stability and lack of hackiness of the second system, but without all of the extra frills and embellishments. That's your third system. So the real question here is, can we write the third system first? And I don't think we can write the third system first, but I think we can write it second. However, this is probably the most important lesson that Brooks has to impart. And I have seen company after company after company, including plus billion-dollar-plus unicorns, ignore this to their peril. It is not a question of whether to prototype and then throw the prototype away, because the prototype is going to get thrown away at some point. The real question is, are you going to ship that prototype to your users, or are you going to ship them something stable? So let's take a step to the side, and I'll just introduce the company that I'm working for, the problem domain that we're working in, and then we'll get into how we're rearranging our development method, how we've rearranged our development methodology to try to satisfy both the needs of a quickly moving market and the security demands the security standards that Langsec holds us to. Okay, so back in 2014 in West Africa, there was an outbreak of Ebola. So the guy who's now my CEO, Emerson Tan, was doing some volunteer work for Doctors Without Borders when they found out that the Sierra Leonean Central Bank was 6 weeks away from running out of cash. They ended up finding a local development shop that had built a payroll system that paid people in cell phone minutes, as is common many places in Africa. The question was, can we scale it? And by God, they did. This system is still running today. And it kept the entire healthcare system in Sierra Leone from collapsing during the middle of an epidemic. And so Emerson stepped back and thought, okay, well, isn't this something that we see a lot in the disaster space? Because before an event, there's time to prepare for crises that happen. After the event, there's some immediate response. That's usually in the form of like material goods. But during the recovery phase, when people are starting to rebuild, we can definitely help if we can help provide cash as aid, which is something that many NGOs are actually really interested in doing now. So we're working with like the Red Cross, the United Nations Development Project, and a few countries are a few countries that have financial inclusion strategies. They're trying to get mobile payments rolled out everywhere in their country, including really rural areas. So what we're building is basically the following. First of all, we need a digital cash protocol that works offline. We're building an Android application that uses this protocol so that people can pay each other peer-to-peer or over the network when that's available. There's a service that's tied to the app, which I'll explain in a little bit. There's an administrative backend for the charities and NGOs that run these payment schemes to actually decide, okay, who gets how much money. There's a front end that they actually touch. As part of the system, we're using a Java card to actually act as a wallet and hold people's balances because although it's technically a centralized system, we're trying to distribute it as much as possible. And there's a simulation engine that I'm not really going to talk about in this talk because we don't really have time for that. One question I get a lot is, are you using a blockchain? No. Can't use a blockchain when you can't rely on the network. So we had to build something else instead. So we basically spent the first 6-ish months of operations. This actually all started last September. So Emerson had arranged some funding. Our funders told us basically you can have this much money to build a prototype, and if we like what we see, we'll give you twice that much to take it to beta. And we're like, okay, we can deal with that. But we have some additional constraints, such as weather. So one of the regions that the UN is interested in us operating in has some pretty serious flooding in late fall every year. So that tells us something about when we need to deliver by. So what is the time we have available? As I said, so we really got rolling, code-wise in October. We started hacking a prototype together. And that dotted line at the end of February is when we delivered is when we showed the prototype to the investors and got that second tranche of funding. So we're basically treating that entire prototyping time plus the first month after the milestone as planning time, because that is the time that we took in order to figure out what everything was supposed to be, what everything was supposed to do, and how it was supposed to talk to each other. And our principle for this was make it work in literally anything that will get it rolling at all. We will, if we need to make it scale later, we will rewrite it in something different. We are committing to rewriting it anyway, so don't worry about things being slow. If you're concerned about this connection needs to have privacy on the wire, that's going into the architecture docs, but don't spend the time on it now. We just want to get it working at all for a demo. So the next 3 months after that, we blocked out for coding, and that gives us 2 months for early testing and 2 months for full system testing in Brooks's typology. So first and foremost, continuous build on everything. When things land in the repo, they should work. They should have tests. They should be not just unit tests, but we should also write integration tests to get things talking to each other as quickly as possible. Get it to work full stop. Make notes about what did not work. The other thing you keep is the interfaces. Like if you're working in, this is one of those things that's really clear if you're working in Java, less so if you're working in a language that doesn't have a formal notion of interface. But when I say interface, I am talking about anything where one component talks to another. And you keep the tests you used because you want the same happy path behavior that that you tested for in the prototype. That's how you know that you're still on the right track in production. So we prototyped an app featuring sign up and verification with SMS. You can send and receive money. You can display the balance and the transactions you've seen, and you can chat with the other users. And we didn't actually tie the app into the ledger protocol, but for the prototype, we decided to make them talk to each other during the coding phase. I'll happily answer questions about that one over a beer later because that gets complicated. But because this is Android, we implemented it in Java. So what about the protocol? So we basically wrote a cryptocurrency literally on top of Git. It writes, it is writing to a ledger. The format that we use is HLedger. If you're familiar with plain text accounting, it's a derivative of Unix ledger, and it's a very simple, regular format. Why? Because regular formats are easy to parse. We're using an OpenPGP PKI because OpenPGP is well understood. There are solid implementations of it, and we derive single-use signing keys using the derivation algorithm from the Bitcoin deterministic wallet proposal. And it's basically a linked timestamp chain. That's the picture from the Wikipedia article on linked timestamp chains. It turns out that Git actually is one. And so the reason that we're keeping this as toy problem simple as possible is that this is an attempt to thwart the second system effect coming out of the gate. If we use something as well understood as Git, with as solid a library as Git, that makes it a lot harder to screw up. And so this basically automatically gets us two-phase transactions because commit and merge are the two phases. Executing a transaction is you create an HLedger file, you add it, you commit it with a signature, and you push that commit to the recipient over a peer-to-peer connection between your phones. Consolidating transactions is merging transactions that you've received to a special consolidation branch, and then pushing that back up to origin. The implementation language for this was Shell. It didn't need to be any more complicated than that. We just had to prove it worked. Shell scripts were enough for that. For the backend, IDT, the group in Sierra Leone that had done the payroll system used Odoo. It's a Belgian project, used to be called OpenERP. So we just used that for both the app backend and the management backend. Because Odoo only has a really low-level API, we wrote a higher-level API for the app to talk to. That uses Flask, and that's what got saved. We mocked the two-phase transactions, like I said, and this was just implemented in Python 3, and that was it. And so we also made a pre-commitment. Thomas Schelling, a very famous game theorist who passed away recently, pointed out that if you pre-commit to cutting off some of your own options, that is a really, really credible signal. You may think this is crazy, but one of the counterintuitive results of Schelling's work is that sometimes being the crazy guy is how you win. So if you cut off code reuse as an option, it becomes a lot harder to put in a bunch of extra bells and whistles because you're rewriting from the ground up, and you really only have time to do the necessary. So for the app, we started in Java, we rewrote it in Kotlin. For the backend, we did that API in Flask, we converted it to Go. For the ledger protocol, what was originally done as just a bunch of Git commands in shell, we wrote some JNI bindings to libgit2, and then a higher level interface for those in Kotlin. So how did it all work out? Well, now it's late June. Coding phase is just about done. All components were ported in 2 months, and we are hooking them up now. The early test phase is already sort of underway thanks to continuous integration and our insistence on making things talk to each other as soon as is humanly possible. Most of what we did during that last planning month, that month of March, was we documented everything we could get our hands on because it was all fresh in our mind. We had just finished writing it. We had just demoed it. We were coming off the high of success. We had a lot of energy, and everybody was thrilled to bits that they actually had time to sit down and write down everything they had learned. Like, this was new for basically everybody, and people loved it, and it has been an incredibly valuable resource as we've continued to move forward. We're also in the middle of a hardware purchase right now because it turns out that for smart cards, because it turns out that manufacturing has very long lead times. But because we got that second tranche of funding from the successful prototype, we hired more people, and that has enabled us to spread people out on independent tasks, such as some of the tasks in Flatpak. So we hired our fourth developer first week of April, basically after the planning phase was completely over. And the last time that this guy had touched Java or C was in college, and he had never touched the JNI. He was instructed, okay, take these Git command line ops and turn them into a Java library that we can call that we can call in Android. And it took him 4 weeks to do it. And probably about half of that was the fact that Gradle and Maven are freaking terrible build systems. So what about the app itself? So it turns out that a tremendous amount of Java to Kotlin conversion can just be straight up automated in the IDE. Kotlin is the creation of a company called JetBrains, which also makes the IntelliJ IDE. It's an official Android language now. And its type system allows us to do much more in the way of static analysis than we're able to do on ordinary Java. Furthermore, the original Java app was about 30,000 lines of code, 30,000 lines of Java. Anybody want to toss out a guess as to how many lines the Kotlin app was? Come on, somebody. 60,000? No, way down. Oh, way down. Okay. Yeah, no, the Kotlin app was 3,000 lines. That's readable in a day. That just cut a tremendous amount of time off of our code review time. It no longer takes us anywhere near as long to understand the what we had before was an error handling routine. What we have now is a very simple pattern matching routine that is just the picture of clarity. And that's what we're really aiming for. Code that people can understand by looking at it. Interfaces that people can understand by looking at them. That's how you don't make mistakes. That's how you don't miss anything. How long did this take? 2 weeks. That was it. Okay, so what about on the back end side? So it turns out that it's really, really easy to move like a Python API over to a Go API. You basically start by, what the backend guys wrote during the month of March was RAML specifications. They can auto-generate stubs from that, and then they just populated them with delegated calls to the Python API and replaced the function bodies one at a time. Simplest thing ever. Most of what they've been doing since then has been some fairly elaborate HA proxy scaling that I don't really have time to get into. We should really step back and take a look at what we've learned here. So one thing that we did kind of screw up on a little bit was you need to schedule time for human processes too. People need time to be onboarded. You also need time to find them in the first place. Purchasing things also takes time. Being able to see what tasks depend on each other helps a whole lot. I didn't include it in these slides, but if you find me sometime today, I will happily show you the dependency graph that we're using. It's in Trello, and I'll happily talk to you about how we put that together. Another thing that I found, being in management is that I don't code as much anymore. But I have found that if I just step in and remote pair with some of my with my teammates every once in a while, just step in on somebody and kind of rubber duck for them for half a day, I find that I understand what they're doing a lot better. And if there is a misunderstanding somewhere, if somebody misunderstands like how what they're working on is supposed to communicate with another piece of the system, I can help them correct that sooner rather than later. If you are disciplined enough, you can avoid the second system effect. I think we have managed to do that so far, but I don't feel like I can really speak authoritatively about that until we've shipped. So that's what I've got. I think we've got about 2 minutes for questions. Oh, we do?
Yeah, we have quarter of an hour left.
Oh, okay. All right, I did come in on time. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I cut this down from a 50-minute talk. So I'll gladly take questions if there are any. Yes?
Wait. Because I always wanted to do this. Where are you?
With one hand.
Speak in the black thing.
Is this?
Side of it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. I was wondering if you were to do another project like this, and seeing as how you really liked, that's at least how it seems, working with Kotlin, if you still commit to rewriting everything after the first prototype in a different language, what are you going to do? I mean, maybe at some point you'll be faster in the first go in using Kotlin, and then you have to.
That's a really good point. And so I have to admit that that committing to throwing the first one away was not my original idea. I don't know how many of y'all know Felix Lindner, the owner of Recurity Labs. He also runs the company that my husband works for, Pecky GmbH. Their product is a peer-to-peer distributed trust layer, and they still haven't actually released it yet because this is one of those products where you basically have to get it right the first time or you lose. So they did the first cut in Java, and they actually decided that they were happy enough with parts of it that that they decided to just keep those parts entirely. Like basically the Kademlia implementation was solid enough that they decided to keep it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that I could easily see myself doing, as you say, once my team and I are more adept at Kotlin going forward. I have actually been, talking with, TQ and his teammates some about, so how do you know when it's good enough, right? I mean, this seems like sort of one of those Justice Potter Stewart, I know it when I see it kinds of things, and that's just not good enough for me. So I'm still trying to figure out an answer to your question, I think is what I'm trying to say here, but I'm very actively trying to find the answer to that question, and I hope to have more to say on it soon. I'll try to write a blog post on it or something.
Thank you.
Bad catch. You said rewrite everything, but you retained your testing, your tests.
Yes.
Clarify, like, did you rewrite the tests in Kotlin?
Jean-Michel did, actually. He wouldn't have necessarily had to, because you can totally test Kotlin with JUnit. In this case, he did, and it didn't take terribly long to do it.
Thank you. Please be close.
Over there.
Oh, not a hope.
You could pass it down, like just hand it.
Did I understand correctly that you took the original Java code and converted it to Kotlin?
Much of the port was an auto conversion. Not all of it. A few things were done by hand, but the reason this works is that the Java virtual machine is very, very well defined. And so the Kotlin specification is built directly on top of the directly on top of the Java VM specification in such a way that these kinds of simplifying transformations can be proven equivalent.
Okay. Isn't that a bit of cheating if you claim that you're throwing everything away and restart?
I don't think so. I mean, that seems like more of a philosophical debate. I mean, gosh, let's argue about that later. but I don't know if I want to eat up all the rest of the Q&A time with this question. I mean, because the main point of, because you'll notice, right, that if I go back to the animation, which I wish I could actually pause, but it's a GIF, unfortunately. Oh, let's forward from there. I went way too far ahead. Oh, there we go. So, I mean, if you notice, that's just a huge, pile of if statements. And semantically, the pattern matching that you end up with at the end of this transform, semantically it's identical, but with one important exception, which is that what you end up with at the end of this transform is null pointer exception free. So, yeah, I mean, I really do feel like sort of split two ways on this, right? Because on the one hand, like, it just makes sense to take the thing that worked but was ugly and transform it into something readable. And I guess this gets back to the earlier question about how do you know what to keep, right? It's like, well, we knew that we know we're keeping these error codes. We just know that we're going to identify them. We're going to match against them and operate on them in a functional way instead of a procedural way. Does the fact that we get that from a mechanically applied transform with, okay, I'm not going to loop the animation again, but you might have noticed that at some points he was changing type signatures around. So I mean, like that's the kind of the type signature of that function, or of those two functions that you see there, are not the same as the original Java type signatures. And my type theorist friends will certainly argue that making a change in the return type or the parameters of a function is actually a very significant change. And those changes were made manually. So I feel like we could go down this rat hole for a very long time. It would actually be a very interesting rat hole, and we'd probably learn a lot. But are there, before we do that, are there any other questions? Yeah. Thank you for asking a question that made me debate myself on stage.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your talk. Yeah, when I look actually at your GIF, I'm actually wondering if I look at the error code, number 3 is actually method not allowed. The other one is user inactive. I'm wondering actually why are you not separating those two things, because method not allowed is for me something different than a user which is inactive. And password invalid. I would separate those things actually. So I'm wondering that why you didn't do that. Why do you still have actually the same concept of the if statement list you had it previously?
Well, I mean, that's fundamentally what pattern matching is. Pattern matching is just a lot more readable.
Yeah.
But and that's and that's something valuable. I mean, if it takes you less time to read and understand the same amount of code, you don't have the worry here that oh God, is one of these if blocks going to contain something complicated?
It's not that part, but it's more like the part like if I think about the next time I need to add a new error code,
right?
Should I really dig inside a function? I don't think so. I think it should be really easy actually to add this kind of error messages.
I mean, I get where you're coming from with that. I get where you're coming from with that, but don't forget that this is Kotlin, and Kotlin is a functional language, and you kind of can't not have it be a function.
Okay, yeah, I'm more actually a Python guy, so...
Sure. Yeah, Python lets you blend them really nicely, and that's the thing I love about Python.
I have one other comment regarding what you said, that you actually have to throw away your code when everything is functional. Or at least, that you should start over. I think that everything starts with an idea, but it does not mean that that idea is good. You still have to figure that out.
Yes.
And most of the time, we figure out it's not good. So the second time when you rebuild something, it will be definitely better because you learn from all the mistakes you actually did not cover in the first time. So that's the reason why it is good actually to rebuild something. I think one of the software developers said something like, like if you have everything functional, just throw it away and start over. And it sounds ridiculous, this plan, but yeah, your code will be much, much better.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if someone else have questions, because I can pass the keyboard first. No? Yeah, can I? No. Oh, there we go.
Okay, Meredith, the way you worked, how much, it's difficult to measure it, but how much safer did it get? Big sigh.
Metrics are hard. Metrics are really hard.
And how much emphasis was on security?
I mean, emphasis is very much on security now. Almost no emphasis was placed on security initially. Like, I had, one of my backend developers asking, should I throw HTTPS on this Flask interface? No. We'll do it in production, obviously, but we don't need to do it right now. So, like, pretty much anything DevOpsy that applies to security, we didn't do it during the prototype. However, one thing that we have discovered as a result of the port from Java to Kotlin, Kotlin is advertised as a null pointer exception-free language, and it delivers. So NPEs are obviously harder to exploit than it's like bare C pointer issues, but at the same time that's a reliability issue. Like you don't want your app just crashing on people all the time. So we're still collecting those metrics is the Weasley answer. But I mean, things are looking good already.
Yeah. Have you done some intermediate penetration tests already? Or code reviews, especially with focus on security?
I mean, we've been doing internal code reviews.
Okay.
So I mean those have looked good. We've not engaged any external pen testers yet. That is on the
The wish list.
It's not on the
Project
it's not wish list is wrong. Roadmap is actually
Okay,
the
yeah.
word I was searching for. But yeah, we haven't done it yet.
Okay.
No, that will happen before we go to the field, though. Obviously.
Good thing.